Welcome back to On Just Terms, the video podcast series by HSF Kramer, where we examine the shifting litigation and regulatory forces shaping corporate Australia through candid conversations with leaders in the fields of governance, commercial and legal risk, and reputational management. Today we're joined by Hamish Hansford, Head of National Security at the Department of Home Affairs, who also serves as Australia's Commonwealth Counter-Terrorism Coordinator and National Counter-Foreign Interference Coordinator. Hamish has spent his career at the forefront of some of Australia's most complex issues, working at the intersection of cybersecurity, critical infrastructure, and national resilience. In this episode, we'll explore what a rapidly shifting national security landscape means for how Australian organisations and how business leaders should be thinking about governance, risk, and preparedness.
Hamish, thanks so much for joining us today.
Great to be here.
We've obviously had the benefit of talking to you a few times before, but for the listeners who aren't as familiar with you, can you talk us through a bit about your background and also what your current role is?
Sure. Public servant for 25 years and principally in a security domain, which is pretty fitting because right now I head our national security function in the Department of Home Affairs, everything from the protection of government, the protection of critical infrastructure, cybersecurity, technology security, foreign interference, obviously countering it, as well as do law enforcement have the right powers they need to combat organised crime. So pretty broad remit, but I'm trying to bring together how we respond to the threat in a much more cohesive way.
We'll come to that kind of coordination piece and proactivity and regulation maybe a little bit later. But one key pillar, and I suppose part of your remit, is the cybersecurity strategy for 2023 to 30. So can you walk us through what that's about and what you're hoping to achieve?
Sure. So I worked on the 2020 cyber strategy as well, and that was really about how do you protect the economy from a defensive perspective and focus on critical infrastructure. And then we reformed the critical infrastructure regime over the next couple of years. And so by the time it got to 2023, we thought the missing bit was both workers in the economy and small to medium business and individuals. And so building on the 2020 strategy, which continued to look at government and critical infrastructure security, we tried to do things like an Act Now, Stay Secure campaign for every Australian to really work out what are those simple things you can do to make yourself more secure. A range of different pilots on small business, continued investment in law enforcement, on cybercrime, and then how do we shape the world around us? Everything from our capacity building in the Pacific right through to leading on our counter-ransomware initiative internationally. So it's trying to put lots of different pieces together to try and have an impact on the Australian economy in a positive way.
And this is because these issues and threats that sit within your scope are beyond just national security things. You're talking about individuals.
That's right. Well, individuals are part of national security as well, because the more resilient an individual is, whether that's digital resilience, being able to help yourself from a prolonged outage by having food, medicine at home if there's a storm coming. Individuals, I think, are often the missing bit of national security, but we did deliberately focus on infrastructure government first because they're critical to the functioning of the economy. And now it's about everyone playing their role in national security.
Since the last time we spoke, we've had a bit more time now with the ransom reporting regime for certain entities. I thought you might be able to share some reflections on that mandatory obligation, the information that's being learned from that process and what we can take away from it so far.
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is we're one of very few countries in the world that has ransomware reporting. Whenever I go to some of our international meetings, it's really remarkable that we're kind of leapfrogging like-minded countries in trying different things. And I think the most interesting thing the UK is doing is working out how they might implement a ban on the payment of ransoms. We didn't quite get there in our 2023 strategy, but our minister at the time said that was her ambition, but the economy wasn't ready. So the fallback is, how do you understand what's happening in the economy? And up to 31 March, we've had 97 ransomware reports, which means 97 payments, and lots of people are in the unfortunate position where they have to pay a ransom because they don't see a way out. And I think I was really struck by a couple of things. The first thing is that's a very low number. So we're trying to work out, is that a true representation of people paying ransoms in the economy, or is it underreporting? I think it's probably underreporting, particularly when we match up with some of our private sector data in terms of the volume of payments that people are likely paying, but we're still working out if that's accurate. I did think that there would be a disproportionate number of smaller entities paying, given they're less capable to be able to respond to a cyber incident, but the reports we've got are pretty mixed. And so we're trying to work our way through what do we learn from the small number of reports. And I would say that the number one thing that we're trying to ask is, if people do pay a ransom, the reporting is important because we're trying to work out how do we stop people from paying ultimately. What are the things that make people pay, and how do we start to make a much more hostile environment for criminals? So I think a bit early to tell, but gives a bit of a sense about what I think is one of the world's first ransomware reporting regimes.
Do you think there might be some reasons why there is, if there is, an under-reporting? Like what some of the incentives there that might be impacting people's appetite to report?
Yeah, I think the first and probably the biggest thing is awareness. So what is the requirement? Who does it apply to? And we've got a lot of work to do on building awareness, including through people like you. But I think that's probably the biggest blocker. And then it's really for some people a shameful act that I talked to some businesses, and they said it was such a difficult position we were in, and it was in some circumstances people would either go bankrupt or have to pay a ransom to keep their business alive, and so that's a really difficult decision to make, let alone having to report that to the government. And what we were trying to do is bring light to what is a very dark situation, because the more payments there are underground, the less likely people are trying to normalise the issue. And we are trying to normalise it. It's non-punitive, and we are trying to understand the volume, but it is a very difficult situation. And while people pay, criminals get richer.
Yeah.
And when people don't report, we don't understand how it's happening.
Yeah, understood.
It's probably a good segue into another theme we touched on last time we spoke, which is, I think everyone was chilled when we heard you say it, but it seems quite accurate. You described the current climate that we're in at the moment as an all hazards threat environment. So it wasn't that long ago, it was maybe 6 months ago. I'm assuming we haven't changed dramatically, but maybe first, what does that mean? What are the range and different types of threats that we're facing, and how rapidly is it changing? Has it changed since last time we spoke?
Sure has, and things continue to get much more complex, degraded and difficult. And I think the best example is, do you remember the firebombing of the Adas synagogue? ASIO has now said that was a state-based actor, the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, using criminal proxies and cutouts to have effectively a terrorist act on Australia. And so immediately you step back and say that's state-based actions, foreign interference, it's organised crime, and it's an act of politically motivated violence. And so all of the threats are starting to blur together, and it's difficult for individuals to say, well, what threat am I facing? It's somewhat easier in the cyber domain, but even there, you don't often know who the actor is. And so I think all threats are blurring together, particularly in the online space, when you kind of think about what is the environment and what threat should I be looking at. And so if you think back to the old days where you could deal with terrorism, sabotage, espionage, foreign interference, cybersecurity threats, the all-hazard approach really says what might materially impact my functioning, or me as a person, or me as a business, and how do I start to build in layers of mitigation? And they do cross over.
Could we pivot a little bit, although it's related to the blurring, to the the continued emergence of AI? I wanted to ask you a question around that, because we are constantly talking about AI to our client base. They are talking to us about it. It's probably one of the biggest emerging technological, geopolitical changes in my lifetime, when we finally understand it. I imagine that just as our clients are being told, hey, use this, it's efficient, it's cost effective, and it can elevate your thinking, it's also a platform for elevated threats. And maybe that's a complex question, I know, to unpick, but maybe you could talk a little bit about how AI might be impacting threat and threat assessment.
I think the biggest thing, and one of the big discussions from a security perspective, is AI is very good, or will be very good in the future, particularly if you look at Mythos and the model that's coming down, and it's one of many that will be models that will disrupt us every couple of months. But when you get to the core of it, the basic settings that we have, fixing vulnerabilities, putting in place multi-factor authentication, the basics can actually go a long way to mitigation of AI enhanced threats. And if you play it forward, AI might find vulnerabilities that have been there for 20 years.
Right.
So actually the response that we've always said is to fix vulnerabilities, to patch, to do all of the basics is so much more important. And then over the top of it, how do we use AI to help us secure systems? So how do you get AI to help patching? How do you understand that, and how do you go hunting for the threat? I think it can be used both in a security threat perspective, but also in a defensive way. And that's what we've got to get to. But I think the basic settings have to be in place.
I know there must be an ever-increasing sophistication of threat, but are you seeing that AI is being deployed by bad actors in a heightened level of sophistication now? Is that an extra dimension to this?
I think it's starting to occur. Right. So you see the volumetric phishing scams getting much more sophisticated, and the language is getting better. I just see that will continue to enhance. And if you don't understand, you don't have digital literacy, you don't plug the security vulnerabilities, you're much more exposed. And so I think it's starting, still not huge numbers in terms of volume, but that will change very, very rapidly.
Yeah. Well, the pivot then to the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act. I can't believe I actually got that out without fluffing it. We've had, congratulations to me, we've had a few years now of the industry having to rise and respond to that new legislative environment, and I thought we'd get your commentary on how we're looking. Is the Act achieving its goals, and are we seeing remediated risk levels in that space?
Well, it's a bit of a roller coaster. So we go through periods of bringing in new reforms and implementing new obligations, which we see an uptick in people engaging, understanding. And then as time goes on, people lose sight of the obligation and they either reconnect, personnel change, management kind of gets a bit old on what their obligation is. And so I think we're in a period where we've spent the first couple of years educating, we've started our compliance regime. The next phase will be, how do we actually bring out the serious non-compliance? Because we know there are people out there waiting for infringements to have a catalytic effect on, actually, this is a serious issue. And whilst the majority of businesses I talk to are taking risk management seriously, there are examples, particularly when we speak to consultants and people like yourselves, where there are a small number of companies who are ignoring the obligations and people are not taking it seriously. So they're the people we really want to help, because risk management in particular, which is at the heart of the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act, is good business. It's good business practice, and it actually will make businesses much more profitable in the future, because one cyber attack or one act of sabotage or one trusted insider can have such a detrimental impact on reputation, cost, and the functioning of infrastructure, particularly given what we're seeing, particularly out of the United Kingdom with the cyber incidents on operational technology and ones that are actually impacting the functioning of businesses. And Jaguar Land Rover is a really great example. The amount of money that costs the British economy and flowing down to, I think it was about 7,000 businesses, that's fundamental to the functioning of that company. And we're starting to see that to be much more destructive. And so I think that's coming our way. And the more we can do to prepare the economy, the better. Yeah. And it's not just a matter of loss of data anymore. If the loss of functionality, the sabotage of systems, the targeting of operational technology, that has real world consequences, much more than data, even though data is terribly important.
Yeah.
We've seen some of those warnings that are, I suppose, particularly chilling in relation to, state actors, trying to embed themselves in these critical infrastructure frameworks, not to, as you say, extract data, not to necessarily impact immediately, but in a kind of watch and wait and, and then deploying some severe impacts on those infrastructures.
That's right. I mean, Volt and Salt Typhoon, principally in America, effectively had actors living off the land on systems for up to 5 years. And that is a huge impact, and effectively, when you look at it, a very difficult act to define, self-evidently, because it took a while to determine, but it is potentially catastrophic if those effects were activated. And so I think we've often focused on the immediate issue, ransomware attacks, but the longer chronic threat is what might disrupt my entity, my business, my government. And that is, I think, a bit of a turning point when you look at the world, that we actually had actors pre-positioned for destructive effect. And that's significant and serious.
And so then we've talked about what's a bit chilling, and then we move to, okay, well, how do we get some comfort around that, which is obviously risk management that you've touched on. Interestingly, you've looked at some parallels between where there's been a proactive risk framework, whereas something where it's been a bit more reactive or passive, like in the internet, right? You talked about the internet in the 80s and 90s. What are the learnings that we have from how it was dealt with that emergence of new technology versus kind of what we're seeing now and the attempt that you and the other organisations are trying to make to be more proactive?
Yeah, I think that governments and regulators in particular will always be slower than adaptive technology. And so getting ahead of changes, and we talked about AI, just one example, but you really tell when you walk into a company or a government board room, and you can tell that people are curious, engaged, thinking about the future challenge, have done an exercise, they've engaged in war games. All of those things contribute to a culture of getting ahead of the threats that are coming our way, as opposed to perhaps some other players that are, what must we do? Have we finished the compliance checklist? And they're diametrically opposed approaches. So I think I made the point that if you went back to the 80s and 90s, you might think about the regulation of the internet in a different way. But you got to a point where we said the internet is a force for good and the constraints were very few. But if we had have known what we know now back then, we might have thought about actually banning social media for under 16-year-olds might have been something that we did earlier because there might be an alternate way. It's really, how do you think about the negative things in the functioning of a business, the functioning of government services? How do you prevent those negative externalities earlier? And I think it's all down to culture. If you've got a culture of challenging each other in a polite and respectful way, you're not just waiting for the regulation, you're actually shaping the market, which might mean there would be less regulation.
A lot of the theme here is education and proactivity in that space. That no doubt is not limited to, it needs to extend into boardrooms. We're in boardrooms and there are seasons of focus. There was a season of focus around ESG. There is preparing and uplifting for those disclosures, a season of focus around, is my financial crime platform operating reasonably, AML, CTF risk. Cybersecurity is it's much more fixed than a seasonal change, but I'm hearing different stories as Australia's boardrooms level of preparedness to stand in front of functioning, reasonable, even best practice systems to ensure cybersecurity. Do you have a sense of how prepared Australian boardrooms are? And I'm thinking in the context of directors' duties as well, where it's pretty clear from ASIC that, and others, that if you're not getting cybersecurity risk control right, it's a director's obligation.
Yeah, I think from when I started in my job broadly on cyber issues 6 years ago, there's been a marked change. And being invited into boardrooms and having those discussions and facing questions, I think that there has been a step change. But I do still observe, I get quite a few calls still from chief technology officers, chief risk officers, and they're trying to break through often to the boardroom. And I understand the language of a chief technology officer, but not everyone on the board does. And so I feel like there's this disconnect often between here's the risk or threat and here's the bill that we've got. I think we've got to be better at talking about cost benefit and like, here's the risk we're trying to mitigate. And there are 4 or 5 different options to get there, each with varying levels of mitigation. Yep. And so it's often trying to translate what a chief technology officer or a CISO or a CIO is saying, who's effectively trying to talk to the chief financial officer or the CEO, and they're talking different language. And all the CFO can see is cost, whereas they've got to be talking about resilience and long-term productivity and appropriate risk mitigation. And I see that is maturing, but there is still a fundamental disconnect to have decision-ready decisions from a security professional into the boardroom for effective decision that people actually know what they're making a decision on.
Maybe more of a role for the board then, because in a sense they're better placed to say, I hear what you're saying, I hear what you're saying, and now let's make an assessment of where we should spend our money to mitigate risk to a degree.
I think that's right.
Yeah,
I think that's right.
yeah, okay, that makes sense.
And we were going to ask you, and you've touched on it now, what are you seeing in terms of the organisations who are doing it well from a legal, governance, reputational perspective, those who aren't? What's the top tip? What are the ones who are getting it right doing? Obviously speaking the same language so they can get on the same page about next steps and developing a plan. But what are the other insights that you have for those who are doing it right?
Yeah, so I've got one company in particular in mind, and the level of curiosity from the board and the CEO, it's a stark difference for people reaching out saying, we want to do an exercise with you, we want to have a conversation, we're testing this, we think it's right, but what are you seeing? And this particular company, when a cyber incident happened with another company, the CEO was on the phone to the other CEO going, can I help? What can we learn from what you're going through? I don't think I could have responded in that way. How did you do that? And so the culture of curiosity, shaping the market, reaching out to government and industry stakeholders, you can tell the difference between that company and someone who tries to internalise it and say, I think we've got this sorted, and you're not actually testing something that's rapidly changing. And with AI changing, if you're not actually engaging in that on a day-to-day basis, then I think the curiosity element for me is really the game changer.
Just perhaps finally from me, I'm harping on a little bit about boardrooms because so much of what I see about the future risk in corporate Australia will be influenced by those discussions. Is there a particular message or theme or sort of critical issue that among the myriad that you're trying to get across to corporate Australia that you'd leave them with, or that's particularly important for them to focus on the next year or two?
Yeah, I think particularly when it comes to cyber and AI, if you don't understand it, there's no shame in asking, how does that work? Is this decision ready? Ask for more information, buy in external advice. They're all things that if you're grappling with something that's changing so rapidly, is hard to understand, they're all legitimate questions. And I face it all the time. I don't understand certain technology, how it's deployed, what impact it might have. I think that's the first point. The second point is we will trial different things and get it wrong. And I think that's okay as long as we recognise collectively that we've made a mistake and go back a bit and then try and fix it. So I think it's an area where, given things are changing so rapidly, we need to continuously understand, learn and evolve. Are
you getting a good level of invitations into boardrooms to speak?
Sure am.
Hopefully we can add
great
to that through this discussion.
Yeah,
and I think that's important.
And I think the other perspective is we're trying to get whole sectors together at the CEO level, because the best thing that a government can do is use its convening power to bring different players together and say, how do we learn off each other, and what are the things that we should collectively think about together?
Some excellent insights.
Very good. I'll end it there. Thank you, Hamish.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you for joining us for our discussion with Hamish Hansford, Head of National Security. As we close today's discussion, it's clear that national security and cyber risk is not confined to a government or big business issue. It is an issue that sits with all levels of business, large and small, individuals and government. From Hamish's perspective, best practice for meeting these challenges is about looking ahead, information gathering, coordination between government and industry, and in particular, government working to bring together sectors for broader and more collaborative information sharing and ultimately risk management. Thank you for joining us.